Droids have been a fixture of the Star Wars universe from its inception, but they're also at the core of one of Star Wars' most commonly fumbled plotlines. According to the annotated screenplays, even when working on early drafts of Star Wars, what we now know as A New Hope specifically, George Lucas made the decision that the story should be told from the perspective of those droids, C-3PO and R2-D2. This decision was influenced, like so many things in Star Wars, by the films of Akira Kurosawa, specifically in this case Hidden Fortress, about which George said, quote, "The part that was the most interesting in Hidden Fortress was that it was told from the point of view of the farmers, and not from the point of view of the princess. I liked that idea. It set me off on a very interesting course, because it really did frame the movie in a very interesting way and altered the point of view of all three movies." End quote. But despite being such a core part of the series, droids have always represented a major problem in the political makeup of the Star Wars galaxy. Many droids are clearly sentient, if not alive in the strictest sense, though they never seem to be extended any of the rights of other beings in Star Wars. This isn't exactly a shocking new realization, it's even the subject of one of the old Cracked After Hours videos from the mid-2000s, where they cover kind of obvious subtext in popular franchises. But more interesting than Cracked and its pivot to video is that it's even something the franchise has tried to tackle itself, on and off, basically since the earliest days, on either a systemic or individual basis with individual droid characters. And these attempts and their shortfalls are going to be a big part of what we're talking about today. The way that George speaks about the droid shows this as a consideration he had as well. His framing of them as equivalent to the farmers in Hidden Fortress is one hint at that, and so is the constant fear and existential dread that C-3PO is allowed to exhibit. After all, why would you program that into someone unless you were some kind of sociopath? In recent comments, George reaffirmed that in his conception, the quote-unquote robots were discriminated against in Star Wars, though over the years he's made some other comments implying greater or lesser import and impact on or among the droids themselves for this, like reaffirming that C-3PO didn't have or understand emotions, even though I think him being so afraid of everything is a use of emotion. When discussing the political context of the original trilogy, most focus is often turned to the Vietnam War, but domestic politics in the United States can be seen in the movie as well. The Mos Eisley Cantina scene has the bartender, woo-her, say they don't serve, quote, their kind there, referring to the droids. This was a pretty obvious reference to segregationists, coming barely 13 years after the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and less than 10 after the Fair Housing Act of 1968. So the idea of civil rights would have been very much top of mind in the political landscape of the time. While a Gallup poll does show that in 1964, a slim majority of Americans did support the Civil Rights Act, the people who opposed it didn't just go away as soon as it was passed. And especially the legal challenges related to this would go on for quite some time. For just one example, 1974, much closer to Star Wars' release, saw Morgan versus Hennigan, a case where Boston schools were found to be engaging in de facto segregation. There is something to be said about science fiction or other types of fantasy modeling real-world issues faced by different groups through the use of inherently othered creatures or beings in this kind of franchise, but at least this does go to show that it's something that George would have been thinking about very intentionally at the time. As other Star Wars stories began to come out in the form of comics and especially books, more droids were introduced, and this topic became even more explicitly focused on. One early character who really stands out in terms of expanding the humanity of droids, for lack of a better term, was Bollux, introduced in the 1979 book Han Solo at Star's End, where he kind of played off Han's dislike of droids. Bollux was a labor droid who had worked at the Fondor shipyards, and years without a memory wipe had led to developing more quirks in his personality, which built up and allowed him to circumvent certain prohibitions in his code. For example, he was able to lie to Han, something he shouldn't have been able to do, in order to serve the greater purpose of helping to protect Han's life. This is something that comes up pretty consistently, where a lack of regular memory wipes is what leads to droids developing unique personality and becoming more and more able to act with their own agency. And it's kind of messed up that this is the dynamic that's in play, especially since droids often express fear at the idea of having their memory wiped. It's basically used as a threat for misbehaving children. So a droid that's fresh out of the factory without any memories is kind of like a child or a baby. And then as it builds up its own experiences, it develops its own unique personality. Luke often declines to wipe R2's memory as he feels the independent thought made him more useful, and this became a common opinion among other pilots with their astromechs, especially at the upper echelons of fighter pilot skill. Bollux ultimately wins the respect of Han, and as an older droid model, he talked a lot about his fear of obsolescence, saying, quote, Obsolescence for a droid serves as much like death for a human or a Wookiee. It's the end of function, which means the end of significance. So it is to be avoided at all costs, in my opinion, Captain. After all, what value is there to existence without purpose? So we see a continuing theme of droids having their own hopes and fears here. Another droid, or at least some kind of artificial intelligence, since it's a small blue box named Blue Max, is kept within Bollux' chest as another companion for Han during the Han Solo Adventures trilogy. And he's often treated as an impressionable child, with Han going as far as telling him to watch his language. But much like Bollux, his own actions are shown to have their own goals and priorities within them, being especially concerned with making sure they help Bollux when Bollux was in trouble. And again, all of this just goes to humanize the droids as their own beings with their own agency, and their own hopes and fears, expanding on the elements of this that we see in the original trilogy. While Bollux was probably the prime example of a droid character exploring life as an independent entity, and being used to explore droid rights as a theme, as the expanded universe went on, the idea of broader rights for droids was approached from a galactic political perspective, at least in minor ways. In the courtship of Princess Leia, when Threkin Horm, funny name haver, not to be confused with the arguably even funnier Hrekin Thorm, and more relevantly the president of the Alderaanian Council, is talking at a public conference about making preparations for Princess Leia's potential marriage to Prince Isolder of the Hapans, hoping to make an alliance between them and the New Republic. 3PO asked to speak, intending to propose that they plan a wedding between Han and Leia instead, but Horm initially objects, disdainfully saying, "What? Let a droid address the council?" And Leia kind of gleefully notes that this anti-droid slip-up may actually be enough to get droid rights lobbyists against him, with those lobbyists being powerful enough to end his political career. So that droid rights lobby is at least existing and relatively powerful, although it's not clear if she's referring to that lobby existing within the New Republic as a whole, or just within Alderaan's remaining community, which would be a vastly different scale. Kind of like how a much different scale could be reached by the channel if everyone likes and subscribes. Part of the web supplement for the Living Force RPG campaign expands on some of these ideas behind that movement, which were put forward in an article called Droid Rights, written from an in-universe perspective by two Force adepts living in the Republic shortly before the Clone Wars, and laying out their argument for what they call, quote, synthetic humans, and then talking about them being given additional rights and removed from slavery, saying, quote, "We suggest that droids have rights by virtue of being sentient beings. Too long have droids labored for those whose only claim to superiority is the ability to fit circuit boards together, weld a chassis, or install power cells. A droid once completed is a sentient being with goals and desires of its own, and should be treated as such." The article goes on to talk about how droids are basically all lumped into the same category regardless of the broad range of their capabilities, with many able to functionally think and feel. They go over one example of a protocol droid used essentially as a combination nanny and punching bag, and they noted how the droid expressed discomfort and displeasure at what it was forced to do, once again reinforcing the same kind of agency we see with Bollux, and even using lines that we hear explicitly from C-3PO in the movies to highlight the feelings that they were expressing. When it came to the New Jedi Order series, a 19-book series about extragalactic invaders coming to the Star Wars galaxy, this actually became a pretty prominent issue. Those invaders, the Yuuzhan Vong, used living technology and considered mechanical technology to be blasphemous. As a result, droids were particularly singled out for destruction, with one of the most effective combatants in the war being a series of battle droids called the Yuuzhan Vong Hunters, developed by Lando Calrissian and his wife Tendra's company, Tendrando Arms, very creatively named. But throughout the series, particularly in the first few books, there's mentions of atrocities against droids by the Yuuzhan Vong, with things like mass sacrifice of them being relatively common. But they also become a scapegoat used by others in the galaxy to try to win favor with the Yuuzhan Vong. In the Agents of Chaos books by James Luceno, this is at its most prominent. Han meets a droid on the planet Ruan, who he initially mistakes for Bollux, though this droid, Baffle, strongly denies that he is Bollux. Ruan is home to some of the operations of Salish Ag, an agricultural firm hiring refugees to work on their farms, claiming to do so to advertise their goods as hand-picked instead of using droid labor. But Baffle reveals that the real plan here was to deactivate the droids that used to work for them and replace them with the refugee labor so they could hand over the droids to Yuuzhan Vong as a way to gain their favor. In response to this, Baffle had been organizing a droid resistance to this plan by Salish Ag, and he enlists Han to help sabotage a shutdown order that would go out to enable their sacrifice. There's a whole conspiracy cadre of droids involved in this resistance, again showing their own agency in this situation, and I think it's an interesting case study for something which may have been going on in multiple cases throughout the galaxy. Unfortunately, while this plotline was, in my opinion, a very interesting part of the early books of the New Jedi Order, and while it seemed like they may be setting up for a plotline where the position of the droids in the galaxy gets reevaluated, it takes a backseat in the second half of the series to exploration of the Yuuzhan Vong's relationship to the Force, because, much to the chagrin of the Jedi, the Yuuzhan Vong were unable to be sensed in the Force, and that even raised questions about what respect the Jedi owed them if they weren't really part of life by being unable to be sensed in the Force, something which itself raises some questions about how the Jedi would view droids in this same equation. There were mentions in an interview with Walter John Williams, one of the New Jedi Order authors, which I'll link in the description, about this going somewhat further in a post-New Jedi Order series, where Walter John Williams said, quote, "There was one writer who particularly wanted the next series to be about a revolt of the droids, because basically we have these sentient machines that are slaves, and once they get the idea that they shouldn't be slaves anymore, there's a lot of potential problems." Williams doesn't say who it is, but given the prominence of this droid revolt in Agents of Chaos, I wouldn't be surprised if it were James Luceno, who played a major role in planning the Star Wars content at Del Rey with the New Jedi Order, but that's entirely speculation. So to continue with that kind of speculation, I think there's two reasons this didn't happen though. One, pretty simply, is that we were in the middle of, or shortly after, the release of the prequel trilogy at this point. And then not too long after the release of Episode 3, we started getting the Clone Wars TV show. So the idea of fighting droid armies was probably seen as kind of played out at that point, though there would be some interesting contrast between the droids as an army controlled by the CIS versus them acting as a liberating force for themselves. And I think the other element of this that could be interesting is that there were definitely some latent anti-droid attitudes in the galaxy following the Clone Wars. This is something that we most explicitly see in The Mandalorian, where that's a big reason behind Din Djarin's own hatred of droids, something that he overcomes with IG-11. There was actually a mention of some super battle droids, a group called the Orange Panthax, in supplementary New Jedi Order content, where they were actually recognized for their efforts against the Yuuzhan Vong and given some medals, so we did at least get a couple crossovers there. More importantly though, I think the underlying dynamic is one that Star Wars doesn't want to get too deep into. There's L3's revolt on Kessel and Solo, but that isn't really setting up any long-term development and is kind of played for laughs. It's an interesting background issue or plotline, and it's something that's kind of obvious in the setting. I think everyone who watches Star Wars thinks about this at some point, but changing the dynamic kind of fundamentally upsets some of the premises of the setting. All of the underlying problems here kind of arise because droids are cool, having droids do stuff is cool, and having those droids be more intelligent and sassy makes them some of the most beloved characters, even though that's the part that introduces the problems with this whole arrangement. Whether that comes in the form of more human-like C-3PO and K-2SOs, or stuff like Chopper throwing obscenities at everyone. So we're probably not about to see a point where R2 and 3PO took a side in the Great Droid Rebellion, or where Han, Luke, and Leia consider their complicity in an unjust system. So I expect this will always be something that's talked about to some degree, but I really wouldn't expect they do anything about it in a major storyline, though that alone can kind of work as a commentary on other real-world inaction itself. So what do I know? That's going to do it for our look at the politics of droid rights and how they're expressed throughout the expanded universe, though. Thank you for watching. Remember to leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed the video, and hope to see you next time. Bye, everyone.